Hi, welcome to Wide Open Road Art's Roving Conversation series. This conversation is with Julie Millowick. Julie Millowick has a photography practice spanning 40 years. In that time, she has received wide acclaim for both her arts-based and commercial practice. Her exploration of light in the photographic image has seen her develop a unique and recognisable style. Okay, today we're talking to Julie Millowick, who's currently chair of the Castle Main State Festival and long-term photographer. Had a commercial practice and also as an artist. So, Julie, could you start by just telling us a bit about your practice, how it began, basically?
Well, it began quite a long time ago, in 1968 to be exact. I was doing the backpacker thing and travelling around the world like everybody did in their 20s back then, and I was in Washington DC, and I was actually working as a locally engaged employee at the Australian Embassy in Washington DC. So they employed about 1,500 people, and most of them were people like me who had walked in off the street with an Australian passport, and they would give you whatever job was going. Right. It might be down in the car park or as secretarial or whatever. And so I got a secretarial job, and as soon as you got that job, you went on to, I think it was a J1 visa, so you were safe. You could stay in the country as long as you had that job. So it was very exciting. And I've since, now that I'm much older, I've since, come across people who were doing the same thing. Not that I ever met them, but across Europe, in Germany and so forth. You just go into a Commonwealth embassy or consulate with your passport, and they could legally employ you. Yeah. So that was really fantastic. Yeah. So I was there, and it was the last day of January, and I was in my office, and I opened the Washington Post, and on the front page was a photograph by the very, very famous photojournalist Eddie Adams, and it was taken at 3 p.m. the previous day in downtown Saigon, and it was of General Loan assassinating, I suppose you could say, anyway, shooting a Viet Cong suspect through the head at point blank range. And you see, and we were all incredibly shocked, because we were just, we had come out of the world had come out of a very, very long period of heavily censored photographs and heavily censored films and so forth, in the cinema. So Vietnam was the first war where images were just let go through, and we were all shocked, and it was an image that actually changed the course of history, because up until that point the anti-war demonstrations had really been sort of basically student-based, and that photograph, and then the one about 14 months later by Nick Ut of Little Kim running down the road with the napalm burns, they actually got Mr. and Mrs. Middle Class America out of their sitting rooms and into the protest movement as well, and really put pressure on President Nixon to bring the boys home, which was his promise, his election promise. And so I saw that photograph, and I'd always been interested in photography, just kind of running around taking photos as people do. And I saw that photo, and I knew that I wanted to be a photographer, and I knew that I wanted to change the world. Well, of course I haven't changed the world, but photography's changed me, and when I started teaching at La Trobe, towards the latter part of my career, lots of my students, in fact one of them bumped into me the other day, and she said to me, "You changed my life." And that's really not me, it's actually photography which had changed her life.
But you're the vessel that helped her reach it, really.
I was maybe the facilitator, So I haven't changed the world, but photography's maybe definitely changed my life, and it's changed the lives of other people that I've encountered. Yeah. So there you are, there's a really long answer to your question. And so I just kind of started doing photos from there, absolutely hopeless, useless photos, just so embarrassing, I just don't even want to think about them. And then when I came back to Australia, I spent 3 years studying at Paran, which was the place to do
Yes,
photography.
I was going to ask you about that. There's been so many people come out of Paran.
Andrew was in my class.
Oh, there you go.
Andrew Chapman.
Gee.
And Bill Henson.
Yes.
You know, it was a great year. And
Incredible.
you know, we had Paul Cox and John Cato as lecturers, Athol Smith, and I was actually working I actually then got a job working part-time in Athol's darkroom, which was fantastic training. And then I kind of moved out into the light and set up my own commercial photography business. But at the same time, I was still doing my own work, and at that time I had an exhibition at the NGV called Australian New Work. So it was, you know, photographers like me who were kind of coming out, emerging, and yeah, so still photographing at my advanced age, still photographing. So it's just, I can't imagine my life without photography.
It's wonderful. What would you say about your actual photography, like themes or aspects of it, if you could describe maybe, well, where it's at the moment and where it's come from? Like you say, initially you were, you look back now and you're horrified with how it started, but are there similar themes with what you were interested in photographing and how?
Yes, well, I've always loved photographing people, and when I was at Paran and immediately after Paran, I did a lot of pro bono work for the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. I'm just going through that work at the moment, work from the 1970s and 80s, because I'm about to hand my archive over to the State Library, and I'm really glad that I walked around the street just with a single film camera, of course, over my shoulder with one lens, a standard lens, and I just talked to people. And sometimes I made their photograph and sometimes I didn't. And a lot of the photographs that I made, you couldn't actually capture now because somebody would ring up the police and you'd get arrested, you know? I can remember, well, I can clearly remember because I'm going through old prints and so forth that have survived, and I lived in St Kilda in, you know, a student house. You can imagine what it was like, and the kids all played in the street, you know. All the kids played in the street, and so I knew their mums and dads, and I just photographed them, and then I'd give them a photo, probably a hopeless photo, and you can't do that now. And in summer the kids would just be in little bathers, you know, and the girls, I've got photographs of the girls, you know, they've just got a little tiny pair of bather bottoms on, and they've got their little toy pram next to them, and you know, the boys are on their bikes and all that kind of thing. You just can't do that now.
And child photography issues. Yeah.
So those photos are actually quite valuable from a sort of what the kind of social conditions were like at that time, because it was normal. I've always photographed people and I really enjoy it. Having said that, I am working on a really long-term project that I've been working on for about 7 years now, actually maybe 8 or 9 years, photographing country halls.
Oh, wow.
I began the halls project when I was working on another big project which was Australia-wide as well, for the centenary of World War I. I had this idea, as well as the centenary was approaching, I started looking at World War I memorials and, you know, had all the names, and then it would invariably have this quote, "Their name liveth forevermore." And I began to think about that. Does their name live forevermore? And so I had this idea to bring to life a name on a memorial right across Australia. And the way I decided to do that was to find an interesting story of somebody who went, and then track down a living relative. And that became very challenging, as you can imagine.
100 years.
Yeah, because some of the people that I wanted in the book didn't actually come back. So they had to be tracked through great nieces and nephews who had a different surname.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It was really challenging. And so I did an incredible amount of cold calling, and I'd say, hello, my name's Julie Millowick. I'm from La Trobe University and I'm working on World War I book. Really quickly, so that they didn't think I was selling solar panels. So that was just such an honour to involve myself in that, and some of my selected students, because you'd go into somebody's house and they'd go to the wardrobe and they'd pull something out that sort of hadn't seen the light of day for the last 50 years, and show it to you, and it was a letter or a diary or...
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, it was so moving, and some of the stories were just so moving and so sad. And so then I and the other people who worked with me would, photograph that person with the object, whatever it happened to be. So one of the objects that we photographed the descendant with was a tree, because before the young soldier left, he planted a Currajong tree, and he came back and he was blind, and over his lifetime he used to go to this tree or be taken to that tree, and he put his arms around it just to imagine how much it had grown.
Oh, that's amazing.
So that was still photographing people, but at the same time I was photographing memorials and sometimes memorial halls, because sometimes the memorial was the hall.
Yeah.
So I began to realise that country halls are at this kind of tipping point, because the memorial halls are now coming up to 100 years old, because that's when they were built after the armistice, and some of them are going to actually fall over, and some of them have already been sold into private hands, and others are getting grants to refurbish them, and for a photographer it's always more interesting to photograph them before they've been fixed up, to photograph the kitchen,
The history.
that's got the old lino and everything in it, and rather than the brand new dishwasher and all that.
Yeah.
So I'm really working in quite a structured way on that project. So
that's
it's
that's something you're working on currently.
I'm working on that. Yeah.
So there's a strong historical, obviously, bent in this work, and then it sounds like your earlier stuff there was perhaps with Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. That was there would you say there was a political component to what you were doing, or was it more just about connecting with individuals whose stories might not be told?
Yes, there was definitely both those elements, because the time when I was photographing for the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence was a time when Fitzroy and that whole suburban area was becoming gentrified, and so all these people who lived in boarding houses were being tipped out, and so homelessness was beginning to become quite a significant problem. So that was a really interesting time to photograph, and you could feel that maybe you were giving a voice to somebody who didn't actually have a voice. And of course, just walking around the streets, talking to people or whatever, that in a way was similar, because I don't think that those people who I photographed would necessarily be in the socio-economic strata that people in Fitzroy and so forth now are.
Certainly not.
Especially not in the last 5 years.
So I would still love to be doing that sort of photography, but my days of doing that are numbered. Well, they're gone actually. It's in the past, and so now I'm just doing stuff that I can manage quite well just by myself, and just travelling around and still photographing people, but not that not that on the edge, on the street kind of photography.
Because of the logistics, it's too difficult.
Yeah, the logistics, but also it's too dangerous now for somebody my age. And although I have to say, and Andrew was talking about this last night too, Andrew Chapman, we're finding that because of our age, we're not taken seriously.
Oh,
So
really?
that's okay. That's okay.
Me actually.
Because I mean, out there, I mean, not by our peers and so forth, but out there holding a camera.
Oh, I see what you mean, the public.
People, yeah, the great
Okay.
general public doesn't take us seriously. You know, they see all my grey hair and they just think, oh, you know, it's the granny taking photos, and you know, they would be much more wary of this, you know, of a 24-year-old over here who looks really hip and cool and so forth. But in fact, I'm probably the person they should be
Yeah,
more
I was
worried
going to
about.
say, that could be the mistake, really, and your advantage, maybe.
But yeah, basically it's a safety thing. And I just feel
You've done.
I feel that I have had, and people of my, people who are working in the 70s and 80s, I think we've had the best of it. I think it was a fantastic time. And when we work commercially, you know, of course we work very hard, and we I hope did really good work. But there were actually budgets back then for the annual report, for the brochure, whatever it happened to be. So you could make a really good living as a photographer. I mean, it was really fierce competition. I'm not saying it wasn't, but there were the budgets. But now, to work commercially as a photographer, my heart goes out to all those people coming into the industry, because digital has just dumbed it down. You know, everybody thinks that they can do it, that they can photograph the truck with the Westgate Bridge in the background, and sure they can, but give it to somebody who's really on top of that kind of stuff, and they'll have it, you know, beautifully lit, and it'll be the perfect time of day, and all that kind of thing. Which
It's the craftsmanship of artistry.
Yeah.
And,
How do you think that there have been are there any sort of like positive things that you can see in the advances in technology? Like, are there things about the digital? Age
I mean,
of-
there's fantastic advantages.
Do you what do you photograph with yourself now?
Yes, I use digital.
Yeah.
I haven't used film for quite some time.
Yeah.
But a lot of photographers are going back to film. But my darkroom has been dismantled. What I did for several years, because I got a back injury and I couldn't really hold a camera successfully, I did photograms. So that's where you go into the darkroom and you put a piece of light sensitive paper, silver gelatin paper actually, or that's what I used, underneath the enlarger, and then you put an object on and expose it to light. Obviously you do all kinds of test strips to get the correct exposure so that you don't, waste paper. And so I did that for several years, and I had several exhibitions down in Melbourne with that.
I was looking at some of your photograms because they're online, and they're really beautiful, and they're really there's something sort of sad about them. There's something really emotional, and actually what I thought interesting was some of your other photographs also. I don't know if there's one I'm thinking of in particular. It looked like it might have been the Theatre Royal, but I'm not sure. It might have just been a hall. And there's an emptiness to it. There's a lot of red chairs, and then there's a lot of empty space. And I just felt like your work seemed to have quite a lot of that, like emptiness and then thing. So whether it's a photogram or not, that seems to occur. And it's very sad and beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. The photograms were always part of a narrative. I really like narrative, whether it's, you know, a photojournalistic situation or whether it's with the photograms. So I did this narrative about Anna Atkins, who was really the first photographer to create photographic images that were placed into a book. When we did our training, we were always, well, she wasn't mentioned, and she was only discovered in the 1990s when a private library came up for sale at Sotheby's, and there was one of her hand-stitched books with her unique, images in. They were photograms, but they were actually done with cyanotype, and they were on British plants, British wildflowers and seaweed, and it was just so seductively beautiful, the work. And what happened was a dealer, an antiquarian dealer, put his hand up and bought the book, but he was actually working with about 6 other dealers, and so afterwards they got the book, this beautiful hand-stitched book, and they got their Stanley blades out and cut all the pages out, and sold them individually as unique works of art, and then a PhD student started doing research on Anna Atkins, who was this person, and it was found that she was in collections in the British Museum down there in the basement, and so she became famous, or at least well known.
Yeah.
And so I was very engaged by this story, and so I decided to do a kind of homage to Anna Atkins. And sometimes it was sad, and a couple of times it was funny. But the photogram, because it's so pure, it's absolutely pure. There's no mechanical, action through the way. It's just direct onto the paper. There's something seductively beautiful, and you're right, there is something a little not so much melancholy, but sorry,
poignant,
yes, about the work,
the solitary mark,
and that's right. And the images can be very moving, and you never know what you're going to get. You think you do, but you don't. And then you think that you can do it again, but you can't. You put it back on, whatever it is, and you do it again. But it's different. So that's really, really interesting as well, to kind of explore that. And I think, going to the second part of your question about the halls, because these halls are all old, I'm not photographing new halls. There is this reference when you're in there to everything that has happened. Sometimes good, sometimes sad, but there is a kind of, I hope in my photos there is a kind of echo of all those people over the last 100 years who've moved through the hall in whatever way, a memorial to those who didn't come back from the war, or a wedding, or a wake, whatever it happens to be. And once again, it's just an honour to be able to go in there, be allowed to go in there and take these photographs. I think that for me is one of the most important things, or one of the most, when I think back, the thing that keeps coming up in my memory is that I have been honoured all my life with my camera in my hand to be taken into people's lives and allowed to explore that and to share that, and to be, just for a short time, a part of that person's life, to have that two-way thing happen. It might only be for 20 minutes sometimes, because you're standing on the street or whatever, but if you are genuine in what you want to say about the situation, or what you want to communicate to the person who looks at the photograph, then there is one hopes, and there is a sympathy between the relationship between the photographer and the subject. So you're not ripping them off, you're not exploiting them, you are trying in some small way to tell their story.
So there's an exchange.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a one-way action.
No, definitely not. No, it should not be a one-way action. So,
wondering how many photographers that's their experience of it, or if this is something that's particular to your approach. of really connecting and engaging with your subjects?
I think that that quite a few photographers operate like that, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I mean, you know, everybody has to work in their own way. The advent of digital has been fantastic across so many levels. You know, people who are working in very challenging situations, Syria, Iraq, East Timor, wherever, can actually get their images out really quickly and hopefully reach people, although one wonders how often that happens now because of the desensitivity. So digital has done that to the working photographer. Digital has also opened up photography to billions of people who couldn't do it with film because they couldn't afford it. I mean, it's very expensive buying rolls of film all the time and then paying to get them processed. And, you know, and because it's immediate, you can see it on the back of the camera. That's an incredible joy, and that's, you know, been opened up to billions of people worldwide. So digital has just been fantastic on those levels. But I think it's, at the same time, I think it's maybe, not maybe, I think that some of those sympathies to your subject have maybe fallen by the wayside. And when I was teaching photojournalism online for La Trobe University, I used to every semester have classes on ethics, you know, about, and a really good way to teach ethics, well, there's lots of good ways, but one is to ask, if you were the subject, how would you feel?
Yeah.
So, classic, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but you know, there's some great photographers out there, and so it's just been an absolute honour for me across all the assignments that I've done, commercial, personal, to be a part of that and to have been taken into people's lives. You know.
One thing I just wanted to ask briefly was, with that, the creative and the commercial sides of your practice, was the commercial done was that sort of like a sustaining yourself thing? Like, was that to make money and to fund the creative side?
Yes, because it's really hard to make a living out of creative.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Henson's done it, but he's one of the few. So I used to go to work every day and do, I don't know, 3 jobs or whatever, 10 jobs, I don't know, depending on what they were. Sometimes it was just one job, you know, if you had to travel or whatever. But it was great to wake up every morning and go to work and take photographs and be paid for it.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's
it's
success,
just
I think.
fantastic because most people are not in that situation. They don't get up every morning and go to a job which they just love, you know, and they would be doing it even if they weren't getting paid, if they could, you know, support the mortgage and all that kind of thing. So I have been so lucky. I have been incredibly lucky.
And how did you find that balance? Were you able to, you know...
Oh, it's hard. You know, when you work commercially, because you're under so much pressure all the time, deadlines and bringing in money and so forth, that really your personal work, well, for me, my personal work just kind of fell by the wayside until I could, you know, concentrate on it again, particularly in those early years of setting yourself up in business.
Yeah.
It's
very tough. Yeah.
And like you were sort of touching on that before, saying that you think that the conditions have changed now for photographers in terms of running a commercial business.
Oh, it's terrible.
Really?
Yeah. I know fantastic photographers down in Melbourne who are really on top of it, and you know, they just do such fantastic work, and they're struggling, really struggling. It's terrible.
And that, you would say that's mostly got to do with the technology shifting. What about broader social sort of issues? Like, you live up here in Friarstown. Do you notice a difference in terms of living in Melbourne and sustaining yourself as a creative person? Like, if you know photographers down there, there's been such a wave of people moving up to these parts, and we've mostly been interviewing people from the local area because there's so many creative. And part of what we're curious about is if they're here, is it for a broader sort of social, structural sort of reason that they can't live in the city, or is it more that does their art require them to leave, or how are artists going? I don't know. If you know photographers in the city, do you know that part of it might be that?
Well, I left in November '88, and for the first 6 months that I came up here, I was really in withdrawal about leaving my business down there, and but I just had to let it go, and I found that I really loved teaching, and even though it was only 3 days a week, I loved it. I just loved it, and it was just a real privilege to be able to open this amazing world of photography to people. Just in the classroom with film and darkrooms and things, of course, at that point. But it continued to be like that, with the advent of digital and then online teaching. It was still, you could see people opening up. So I came up here for a specific reason, because I had that job at La Trobe Bendigo.
So you left your business because you had the La Trobe
yes,
job.
but the crucial factor in there was I had a 3-year-old child whom I hardly ever saw. I worked until what I thought was the day before he was going to be born, but in fact it was 6 days before he was born.
But you worked.
And then I was back at work 6 weeks later with a full-time nanny. Because when you're self-employed, you actually have to do that.
Yes, because otherwise you don't have
any money.
There's no maternity leave.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And when you're self-employed and you've built up all that client base, you leave it for more than about 6 to 8 weeks, and they're going to have to, it's gone. So all that work. So
how long did you say you had a 3-year-old? You had a child for 3 years with the business, did you? And then decided you needed.
Well, because I hardly ever saw him.
Yeah.
And so that job came up, and applied on the last day. I was very undecided. But anyway.
You got it, so.
Or the second last day, so that it could get there in the post, something like that. Anyway, it was quite late. But I don't regret doing that at all. Because, as I said, I found out that I really loved teaching, and I got right back into my own photography, and so I also don't regret doing it, because I've seen, I reckon about 94, late 90s, the impact of digital really started to hit all the people that I'd worked with over a long time, really great photographers, and I knew that I was very fortunate to have been given this opportunity to move out when I did, and you're right. I mean, it's a very, very creative community up here. So that's when I got really stuck back into my own work, and I think that this community, this atmosphere was very stimulating towards that, very supportive of it. So it was a perfect shift,
Yeah. Is that about all about that?
Yeah, I think we may have covered all our
everything we needed to cover.
Sorry,